Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we're peeling back the layers on one of history's most, well, let's say misunderstood pursuits, alchemy.
It's been written off for centuries, really, seen as this kind of greedy, failed attempt to get rich quick.
Exactly, just turning lead into gold. But what if we told you it was actually a grand philosophical quest? A quest to prove the unity of the entire cosmos.
A quest that connected spiritual perfection directly with the physical transmutation of matter. We're going to explore this incredible idea that the philosopher's stone itself was revered as a symbol of Christ.
And here's the twist. The alchemist's core mystical belief, this idea of a one thing that underlies all reality, was dismissed by science for centuries.
But now, it's finding this shocking validation in the latest discoveries. We're talking radioactivity, electrons, the very fabric of space.
Get ready to discover how this ancient pursuit of spiritual knowledge really did, almost accidentally, lay the groundwork for modern physics, and in doing so challenged the very definition of matter and the boundaries between faith and fact.
It's a fascinating story.
Okay, so let's start right at the beginning. We have to correct that popular image of the hunched-over old man in a dusty lab just trying to make gold.
Right. That image misses the entire point. To really get alchemy, you have to see it as this highly sophisticated dual system.
Dual in what sense?
Well, on one hand, it was absolutely a rigorous experimental science. They were working with furnaces, chemical processes, solvents, metallurgy.
Real hands-on lab work.
Absolutely. But at the same time, it was a complete, all-encompassing philosophy for understanding the universe.
And the gold, the transmutation of lead into gold, that wasn't the real prize.
And not in the way we think of it. It was more like the final proof. It was the functional demonstration of their entire philosophical hypothesis on the physical plane.
So if their ideas about a unified cosmos were correct, then transmutation had to be possible. Making gold was like the exclamation point at the end of their argument.
Precisely. Gold in this context wasn't just bullion. It was the ultimate state of metallic perfection. So to create it was to prove that you had unlocked the laws of nature, and by extension,
The laws of God.
Exactly.
There's a fantastic quote we found that just captures the spirit so perfectly, this idea of moving beyond mere wealth. It's from an adept named Irenaeus Philetus.
Oh, this one is brilliant. He says, "Would to God all men might become adepts in our art. For then gold, the great idol of mankind, would lose its value, and we should prize it only for its scientific teaching."
It just completely reverses the narrative, doesn't it?
It does. I mean, think about it. If everyone could make gold, it would be worthless. Which means the real value was in the process, in the knowledge you gained about the nature of matter.
So the whole great work, the magnum opus, it was about validating a universal truth system, not about lining your pockets.
Yeah.
But you mentioned a conflict, because not everyone saw it this way. There was another school of thought.
Right, and this is where it gets complicated. You have what's called the transcendental theory.
So what was their take?
These were the mystics who argued that alchemy was purely an allegory. It was only concerned with perfecting the human soul.
So they'd say all the talk of furnaces and dissolving metals was just metaphor.
That's exactly what they said. They argued the physical processes, the heating, the dissolving, the final coagulation of the stone were just elaborate metaphors for spiritual concepts. Things like the new birth, or resurrection, or the union of the soul with the divine.
That seems a little too neat, a little too clean. How does that square with what we know about what these people were actually doing?
It doesn't, really. And that's why scholars, people like Arthur Edward Waite, strongly push back against this purely transcendental view. The historical evidence is overwhelming.
They had labs.
They had labs. They needed furnaces, crucibles, real chemical substances. I mean, Paracelsus, he had this great description of the true practitioners.
What did he say?
He said they were sweating whole nights over fiery furnaces and finding their delight there in the laboratory, not just killing time with empty talk.
So it's undeniable that this was the physical work that eventually led to modern chemistry.
Yes. The key then is to understand the synthesis. How did they manage to merge this incredibly intense physical labor with these profound mystical beliefs?
This is the core of it, isn't it? The essential synthesis.
It is. Alchemy really began as an attempt to apply the principles of mysticism, specifically the idea of spiritual perfection, to the physical world. And that's what gives it that dual nature. It's both spiritual and religious, and physical and material all at once.
And this whole synthesis, this entire worldview, it rested on one foundational idea, one axiom.
the cornerstone of their entire philosophy.
The famous line from the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistos, "What is above is as that which is below, and what is below is as that which is above."
That is the law of analogy. It meant the universe, the cosmos, was fundamentally unified. It was monistic.
One thing.
One thing. The same divine laws that govern the spiritual realm, the above, also govern the material realm, the below.
So, if the human soul could be corrupted by sin and then perfected through a spiritual process, like the new birth,
Then matter, specifically metals, could be seen as corrupted like lead, and could therefore be perfected into gold through an analogous physical process.
this is where we really get to the theological heart of it. Because if the universe is unified like that, then every scientific experiment becomes a form of theological validation. How central was God to the actual practical steps of the great work?
It was everything. It was the prerequisite. The alchemists taught, almost without exception, that the right mental attitude towards God was the first non-negotiable step.
You couldn't even begin without it.
No. They saw the art as a divine gift. You could only obtain it through grace, through humility, and through sincere, undoubting prayer. You had to cleanse your heart of ambition, of hypocrisy, of pride, before you even picked up your materials.
So if your motive was just pure greed,
You would fail. The philosophy held that the moral state of the practitioner was an active ingredient in the chemical reaction.
that's the law of analogy applied to the alchemist himself?
It is. The perfection of gold became a symbol for the regenerate man, resplendent with spiritual beauty, overcoming all temptations. And the base metal, lead, what was that? It was the sinful and unregenerate man. You were trying to physically demonstrate spiritual regeneration in a crucible.
And their ultimate goal, the Philosopher's Stone, that was also woven directly into their Christian faith.
Deeply. The stone itself was seen as symbolical of Christ Jesus.
How so?
Well, the stone was the agent that perfected matter. Christ was the agent who perfected the soul. The power of the stone was seen as analogous to the power of the Redeemer.
And they believed this so completely that it became a tool for conversion. I'm thinking of that quote from Peter Bonus.
A powerful one. Peter Bonus was an eminent scholar of the art, and he stated his firm belief that any unbeliever who truly came to know the art meaning, who successfully performed a transmutation,
Or even just witnessed one.
right. He believed they would straight away confess the truth of our blessed religion and believe in the Trinity and in our Lord Jesus Christ.
So the lab experiment was designed to be a religious epiphany.
Exactly. They weren't just doing chemistry. They were seeking hard, scientific proof for their entire spiritual belief system. It was a quest for God through gold.
And they took this analogy even further, didn't they? Right down to the composition of matter itself.
Oh, yes. They believed that metals were constituted exactly like a human being. They had a body, a soul, and a spirit.
Okay, let's break that down. The body seems straightforward enough.
The body is the easy one. That's the outward form, the observable properties, density, color, malleability, that kind of thing.
The physical manifestation.
Correct. But then you have the soul. They sometimes called it the metalline soul or spirit. This was the inward individual character of that specific metal.
So it's what made silver, silver and not lead, even if they shared some underlying properties.
You've got it. The soul conferred individual identity. But then, and this is the most philosophically important part, you have the spirit.
The all-pervading essence.
Yes. The spirit was the universal unifying substratum, the essence of all metals, and really of all material things. It was the source from which the body and soul even drew their existence.
And this is the concept that is so startlingly modern.
It is. It's this idea of an all-pervading, unifying essence that, as the sources suggest, approaches modern views regarding the ether of space.
So their physical quest wasn't about adding or removing atoms, like we would think. It was about manipulating the ratios of these internal components, the body, soul, and spirit, to help nature along its path to perfection, which was always gold.
Aided perfection. That's a great way to describe it.
So if the philosophy was the law of analogy, they still needed some kind of physical proof that matter could actually change in the first place.
Yeah.
How do they justify the possibility of transmutation based on the science available to them?
Well, from their perspective, they already had empirical proof. The problem was that it was proof based on superficial observation, without sophisticated measurement tools.
We have to put ourselves in their pre-quantitative mindset.
We do. And in that mindset, transmutation was already an experimentally proven fact.
What were some of the big proofs for them?
The most common one, the one you see mentioned all the time, involved copper and iron. If you take a piece of iron, say an iron nail, and you stick it in a solution of a copper salt-like blue vitriol.
The nail turns coppery.
Exactly. The iron appears to coat itself with copper, or to them it looked like it was turning into copper. They saw a transition. The base metal, iron, was becoming the more noble metal, copper.
Which we now know, of course, is just a simple chemical replacement reaction. The iron dissolves and the copper ions in the solution plate onto the surface.
Right. But if you don't know about ions and atomic weights, what you see is one metal transforming into another. It's a perfectly logical conclusion from the observation.
And there was another one with water.
Yes, the classic observation of producing earthy matter from water. Alchemists would boil water in sealed glass flasks for a very, very long time, and inevitably, they'd find a solid, earthy residue left at the bottom.
And so they concluded.
If water, which they saw as a fundamental element, could turn into earth, another fundamental element, then the elements themselves must be fluid and interchangeable.
So if water can become earth, why can't lead become gold?
It's the same logic. And it took centuries for that to be debunked. It was Lavoisier who finally, carefully weighed everything and demonstrated that the residue wasn't transmuted water at all. It was just the water slowly dissolving tiny amounts of the glass flask itself.
But for the alchemists, these observations were all the justification they needed. It solidified their belief that everything was just a different form of a single original matter.
They started with Aristotle's 4 elements: earth, water, air, and fire. But they quickly realized those were too broad. They didn't really explain the unique properties of metals very well.
So they needed a more, let's say, chemical explanation. And this is where they moved from elements as substances to elements as principles.
Yes, the famous sulfur-mercury theory. And this is a really critical point that gets misunderstood all the time. When they said metals were composed of sulfur and mercury, they were not talking about common yellow smelly brimstone or the liquid metal from a thermometer.
They were talking about philosophical principles, essences.
Exactly. So philosophical sulfur was the principle of combustion and color. It was the active, volatile part of a metal. It explained why most metals would change or be destroyed when you put them in a hot fire. It was the principle of change.
Okay, so sulfur is change in color. What about mercury?
Philosophical mercury was the metallic principle par excellence. It was what conferred all the classic metallic properties: fusibility, the ability to melt, malleability, the ability to be shaped, and of course, luster, that characteristic shine. Mercury was the principle of fluidity and permanence.
So if you take gold,
Hmm.
it's the most perfect metal. It's highly resistant to fire, so it's fixed. It's perfectly shiny and perfectly colored. In their system, that meant it was the ideal perfect balance of pure philosophical sulfur and mercury.
You've got it. And the theory could then explain all the other metals as being imbalanced. Lead was imperfect because it had too much impure combustible sulfur. Silver was almost perfect, but it just lacked that final perfect coloring principle of gold.
But then later, especially with Paracelsus, they added a third principle to the mix: salt. Why did they need a third one?
The two-principle model had some holes. For example, it struggled to explain why a base metal like iron could be so highly resistant to fire. So salt was introduced as the basic principle of fixity and solidification. It was what gave a substance resistance to fire, its stability.
So now the model is sulfur for volatility and color, mercury for fluidity and luster, and salt for stability and fixity.
Yes, and that triad gave them much greater explanatory power. You could describe any metal. Copper had a lot of sulfur, which explained its color. Iron, being so hard and fixed, had an excess of philosophical salt. That model became the standard for centuries.
And it was all reinforced by this other belief that metals weren't just inert compounds. They thought they were literally alive, that they grew in the earth.
The growth of metals is such a crucial part of their worldview. Metals were seen as slowly gestating in the womb of the earth, always striving towards the perfection of gold.
And this belief was so strong that they would actually close down mines, right?
Yes, historically, some governments and mine operators would close mines for a period to allow the earth time to, in their view, renew the metal reserves, to let the lead and iron continue their slow journey towards silver and gold.
And, true to the law of analogy, this growth wasn't random. It was tied to the heavens.
Of course, the unity of the cosmos demanded it. Gold was governed by the sun, silver by the moon, iron by Mars, copper by Venus, and so on. It was all one interconnected system. The same celestial forces that governed our fates were also perfecting metals deep underground.
Which brings us back to the grand prize, the Philosopher's Stone. If nature takes thousands of years to perfect lead into gold, the stone must be the ultimate catalyst, the thing that does it instantly.
It was the concentrated essence of perfection itself. The stone was called the medicine of the third order, and it was believed to be capable of removing all the inherent corruption and imperfection from a base metal.
What do they think it looked like?
It was usually described as a powder or sometimes a waxy substance. It could be white for transmuting things into silver or red for the grand prize of gold.
The descriptions of how to make it always sound so allegorical, like that one from Paracelsus.
Oh, yes. He used his triad theory. He suggested the stone was made by mixing and coagulating the rose-colored blood from the lion, which was philosophical sulfur, and the gluten from the eagle, which was philosophical mercury.
It sounds like poetry, not a chemical recipe.
And that was the point. It was secret knowledge. They believed the stone was the pure, uncorrupted essence of the world's soul, the spirit of truth which the world cannot comprehend. It existed everywhere, but it was hidden.
And if the stone perfected matter, then its liquid form, the elixir of life, was supposed to perfect man. Did they really think it could make them immortal?
Not quite immortal. The sources are pretty clear that they were seeking physiological perfection, not endless life. That would be interfering with God's plan.
So what was the elixir supposed to do?
It was generally described as the stone dissolved in spirits of wine. Paracelsus said it purges the whole body of man and cleanses it from all impurities by the introduction of new and more youthful forces.
So it's about extending your life to its maximum potential, perfect health, vitality.
Yes, a perfect physiological state, but still ultimately mortal.
We've laid out this incredible philosophical and theoretical system, but I think the question on everyone's mind is, did it ever actually work?
The $1,000,000 or perhaps the million ounce of gold question.
And one of the claims that sounds the most outrageous is this idea that a tiny, tiny speck of the stone could transform huge amounts of lead.
That specific claim is what brought on centuries of ridicule, especially once quantitative chemistry became the standard. But, if you look at it through a modern lens, their claim finds a really striking parallel.
In catalytic reactions.
Exactly. A modern catalyst is a substance where a very small amount can bring about a chemical change in a huge, almost indefinite quantity of other substances, while the catalyst itself remains basically unchanged.
Can you give an example?
Sure. A tiny amount of acid can convert massive quantities of cane sugar into glucose and fructose. Or a bit of platinized asbestos can help sulfur dioxide and oxygen combine over and over and over again.
So the alchemists were essentially claiming that the Philosopher's Stone was the ultimate catalyst, a perfection catalyst.
That's a fantastic way to put it. And if that's true, it suddenly makes the astronomical yields they claimed at least theoretically possible. It shifts the question from, is it possible, to, did they have the right substance?
And the stories from people who claim they did are incredibly compelling, especially when they come from respected men of science who had no obvious reason to lie.
Let's start with John Baptist van Helmont. This was a hugely eminent physician and chemist in the 17th century. His testimony carries a lot of weight.
And he claimed to have done it.
Multiple times. Though he was very clear that he didn't know how to make the stone, he was a recipient of it, a gift. He described it as a saffron-colored glassy powder.
Let's get into the details of one of his experiments. That's what makes it so vivid.
He recounted taking 1/4 of a grain, which is an incredibly tiny amount of this powder. He projected it onto 8 ounces of hot mercury.
And what happened?
He said the mercury instantly congealed and turned into a yellow lump. After he purified it, he was left with 8 ounces minus 11 grains of what he swore was the purest gold.
1/4 of a grain transmuted 8 ounces. The ratio is just unbelievable.
The math is staggering. It means 1 grain of that powder transmuted over 19,000 times its own weight of mercury into gold. That is the hallmark of this catalyst principle. And coming from a man like Van Helmont, it's very, very hard to just dismiss.
And then there's the story of John Frederick Helvetius, who was the physician to the Prince of Orange. He published this incredibly detailed account in 1667.
Helvetius' story is a classic of the genre. A stranger, who called himself Elias the artist, visited him. Elias showed him 3 large pieces of the stone. He described it as a glassy, pale yellow substance.
But he wouldn't share it at first.
No, Helvetius practically begged him for a piece, but Elias refused. Finally, just as he was leaving, he relented and gave Helvetius a tiny fragment no bigger than a grain of rapeseed.
And he gave him one final crucial instruction.
Right. Elias told him to wrap the tiny fragment in yellow wax before putting it in the molten metal. So Helvetius melted down 6 grams of lead, wrapped the tiny speck in wax as instructed, and dropped it in.
What did he see?
He said the whole mass first turned an intense green, then a deep blood-red color, and then finally, as it cooled, it solidified into what he swore was the finest gold he had ever seen.
But the crucial part is the validation. He didn't just take his own word for it.
No, this is key. He took the gold to be assayed by the master of the mint. They put it through the toughest test they had, the fourth test, which used nitric acid aquafortis. It dissolves almost everything except pure gold.
And it passed.
It passed with flying colors. That level of contemporary expert validation is what makes these accounts so compelling. If these respected men were frauds, they had to be deploying chemical tricks that were far beyond what the official master of the mint knew.
But of course, the physical pursuit wasn't the only path. You also had the high mystics, who took all this powerful language and applied it purely to the soul.
Absolutely. People like Jacob Boehme, the famous German mystic, he adopted the entire alchemical language, the stone, the elements, the processes. But for him, it was all about his Christian mystical philosophy.
So for Boehme, the stone wasn't a physical substance.
No. His stone was the spirit of Christ. And he even described it in a way that mirrored his spiritual belief. He called it a very dark, disesteemed stone of a gray color, which directly echoes the description of Christ in the book of Isaiah. No form nor comeliness.
The spiritual truth dictated the physical description.
Precisely. And Thomas Vaughan did something similar. His stone was the Christian philosopher's stone, the rock in the wilderness. For these mystics, the physical analogy was just so powerful that it became the perfect language to describe spiritual transformation.
But this duality, this tension between the physical and the spiritual, it eventually led to the decline of the art, didn't it?
It did. As the true adepts faded away, that spiritual language provided the perfect cover for charlatans who were only in it for the money.
And this is where we get the popular image of the fraudulent alchemist.
Yes, the era of degeneracy. Simple tricks, like false-bottomed crucibles with gold hidden inside, or hollow stirring rods that would release a little gold powder when you stirred the pot. The mystical language became a shield for simple criminal fraud.
With the most famous example probably being Count Cagliostro.
The notorious imposter. He founded his own Egyptian masonry to give himself a veneer of mystical authority. He was eventually caught red-handed in Warsaw trying to sneak a piece of gold into the crucible during one of his phony transmutation demonstrations.
That contrast really says it all, doesn't it? The philosophical quest of a Van Helmont versus the cheap parlor tricks of a Cagliostro.
It's the two faces of alchemy.
So by the 17th and 18th centuries, this whole worldview, the law of analogy, the single unified matter, was coming under serious attack from the rise of a new empirical science. This is the Great Divorce.
It is. The first real challenge came from Robert Boyle, who we often call the father of modern chemistry. Boyle's mission was to separate chemistry from both alchemy and medicine and make it its own science, focused purely on observation and quantification.
And his definition of an element was a direct shot across the bow of the alchemists.
A huge one. It was a simple but revolutionary negative definition. Boyle said an element is any substance that cannot be decomposed by any known chemical means.
So if you can't break it down any further, it's an element. Full stop.
Exactly. And that definition immediately classified things like gold, silver, and iron as distinct fundamental elements. And if they're fundamental, you can't change one into another. The very possibility of transmutation was challenged.
But there was one last gasp of the old way of thinking, right? A kind of bridge between alchemy and modern chemistry.
Yes, Stahl's phlogiston theory. It was a perfect example of a principle-based science, very much like the alchemist's philosophical sulfur.
Remind us how phlogiston was supposed to work.
Stahl proposed that everything that could burn contained this principle of fire called phlogiston. When something burned, the phlogiston escaped.
Seemed to explain things pretty well.
It did, for a while. A metal was a compound of metallic calx, what we'd call an oxide plus phlogiston. So when you heated it, the phlogiston flew away. To get the metal back, you just heated the calx with something rich in phlogiston, like charcoal.
But it had a fatal flaw.
A big one. It failed the quantitative test. They discovered that when metals burned and supposedly lost phlogiston, they actually gained weight. Something was being added, not taken away.
And that's where Lavoisier came in.
With his stales. Lavoisier demonstrated that combustion wasn't the loss of a mystical principle. It was the combination of a substance with a gas from the air, which he named oxygen. That was the final nail in the coffin for principle-based chemistry.
And that quantitative revolution paved the way for the biggest philosophical blow to alchemy of all.
John Dalton's atomic theory. In the early 19th century, this theory would define the materialist view of the universe for the next 100 years.
What were the key ideas of Dalton's theory that just completely demolished the alchemists' worldview?
Two main things. First, atoms were indivisible and indestructible. You couldn't split them or change them. Second, and this is the critical one, each element was made of unique, distinct atoms of a definite, unchangeable weight. An atom of gold was eternally gold. An atom of lead was eternally lead.
So instead of one unified matter,
You now had dozens of completely separate, eternal, ultimate units. It explicitly denied the unity of the cosmos that was the heart and soul of alchemy.
this must have been a powerful weapon for anyone arguing for scientific materialism or even atheism in the 19th century.
Absolutely. Dalton's atom was the ultimate proof. Matter was eternal, it was solid, it was pluralistic, and it was completely self-contained. It didn't need a unifying spiritual source or a world soul to explain it.
So transmutation went from being scientifically difficult to being philosophically impossible.
It did. It would mean changing the fundamental eternal nature of an atom, which was a contradiction in terms. Alchemy became the poster child for superstitious pre-scientific delusion.
The death of analogy.
Exactly. And that solid billiard ball atom, that absolute certainty, would dominate science until the very end of the 19th century. Although there were a few whispers even then. Some chemists felt Dalton's theory was maybe only chemically true, but not necessarily the absolute truth about reality, a tiny seed of doubt.
The historical irony is just incredible. Just as the scientific establishment declares victory over mysticism and establishes this eternal static atom, the 20th century arrives and begins to tear it all down.
The universe had a major surprise in store for Dalton's atom. The revolution began with the discovery of radioactivity. We can really call it modern alchemy.
It started with Becquerel and the uranium rays.
And then the Curies, with their discovery of radium, which was intensely radioactive. The crucial thing they found was that this radiation was coming from deep inside the atom, which meant the atom was not indivisible.
And it wasn't static either.
Far from it. They discovered that atoms could spontaneously disintegrate. Radium, for instance, emits rays and a gas, and in the process, it undergoes a spontaneous change of one element into another.
Radium literally transmutes itself into a different element.
Yes, by spitting out an alpha particle, radium becomes neutron, a completely different element with a different atomic weight. This was the alchemist's dream, realized in nature.
The implications must have been earth-shattering.
They were. The eternal elements were not eternal at all. They were fluid, transitory things subject to change, just as the alchemists had insisted for 1,000 years. The philosophical foundation of 19th century materialism just crumbled.
But that was just the beginning. The final nail in the coffin for the materialist atom came with the discovery of the electron.
Right. Scientists studying cathode rays found they were made of these tiny particles, electrons, about 1,100/1700th the mass of a hydrogen atom. But then J.J. Thomson and others ran experiments that led to a conclusion that is still, frankly, mind-bending.
They concluded that the mass, the perceived stuffness of the electron, was entirely electrical in origin.
This is the moment the whole materialist worldview collapses. If the mass of the fundamental particle of matter is electrical, then the electron is, as one source puts it, nothing but a disembodied electrical charge.
It isn't a tiny piece of stuff. It's a phenomenon, an energy event.
Right. And at that moment, matter is revealed to be, at its core, an electrical manifestation. The very foundation of scientific atheism, the hard, eternal stuff of the universe, was proven by science itself to be an illusion.
The universe was found to be fluid, energetic, and composed of a single unifying principal electrical charge, not dozens of separate types of matter.
It was an accidental but monumental vindication of the alchemists' monism. And Rutherford's model of the atom, with the positive nucleus and orbiting electrons, just clarified this unity even further.
Because it showed that an element's properties weren't really about its weight.
Exactly. The chemical properties, what makes an element behave the way it does, are determined only by the number of its outer electrons, what we call the atomic number. The total mass is secondary.
Which brings us to the final, beautiful piece of the puzzle, the validation of Prout's hypothesis.
Prout's idea from 1815 that all elements were just made of hydrogen was dismissed for a century because of all those messy fractional atomic weights. Chlorine being 35.46 was the classic example.
But the discovery of isotopes changed the game.
Completely. Aston's research proved that isotopes are chemically identical elements with different weights. And those fractional weights are just because elements in nature are mixtures of these isotopes, which do have simple whole number masses.
So chlorine isn't one thing.
No, it's a mixture of two different kinds of chlorine atoms, one with a mass of 35 and another with a mass of 37. The average is 35.46.
Which means at the fundamental level, the building blocks of all matter are simple, whole number components. Essentially, they're all built from hydrogen and helium.
It is an absolute powerful validation of the alchemists' belief in a one thing. The physical world is unified at its deepest level. It's all one essence, just arranged in different ways.
So let's come back to that all-pervading essence, the spirit of the alchemists. Does modern physics still have a place for a concept like the ether of space?
It's a controversial idea, but philosophically and scientifically, something like it seems necessary. To explain how light travels through a vacuum, you need some kind of continuous, ubiquitous medium that fills all space, the ether.
And a scientist like Sir Oliver Lodge theorized that matter isn't even a primary substance.
Right. He suggested matter is just a singularity or a stress center in this much denser, omnipresent ether. Matter is just a localized disturbance in the universal essence.
That is the ultimate connection back to the alchemists.
It is. The etheric theory means that the ancient doctrine of the alchemical essence is, and I'm quoting here, fundamentally true after all. Out of the one thing, the ether, the essence, the universal spirit, all material things are produced simply by adaptation or modification. The monistic theological core of alchemy has been independently verified by modern physics.
And as for the practical goal, transmutation at will. We can do that now.
We can. Rutherford's experiments bombarding nitrogen with alpha particles to produce hydrogen proved it. We have conquered the great alchemistic objective.
But the goal has changed, just as Philalethes predicted it would.
It has. We know how we could, in theory, make gold by knocking particles out of bismuth or thallium. But as Professor Sadi pointed out, the goal wouldn't be the gold. The real prize is the incredible amount of energy you would release by controlling these subatomic processes. That energy would be worth far, far more than the gold itself.
The physical prize is obsolete. The scientific teaching is everything. The circle is complete.
Absolutely. The great materialist detour of the 19th century has ended right back where the mystics said it would.
So we have journeyed from the mystical theology of Hermes Trismegistos through the sulfur-mercury-salt triad, past that huge divide created by Dalton's solid pluralistic atoms, and into our modern age of radioactivity and subatomic physics.
And we've seen that the alchemists' foundational belief, their faith in a single unifying essence, which so perfectly mirrored their faith in God's unified design, has been validated.
Not by their furnaces, but by the deepest scrutiny of modern physics. Matter isn't static, it is fluid, it is composite, and it is fundamentally one.
The scientific consensus had to abandon those old materialist certainties. The universe is unified, and transmutation is real.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner? Consider this provocative thought. The alchemists believed that mastering the physical process, transmutation, was intrinsically linked to the spiritual process, the perfection of the soul. That was their law of analogy. Now that science has definitively proven the material possibility of transmutation and the unity of matter, validating their claims about the below, does this resurgence of monism force us to reconsider the validity of the analogical and mystical foundation upon which that physical knowledge was first sought? If the alchemists were so right about the nature of the physical world, what truth might still reside in their claims about the nature of the soul?